Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this very important episode of the Project Liberal podcast. We are joined today by the fabulous Virginia Postrel. She has been talking about and thinking about these important issues since for decades, since before a lot of these things were on the radar of people as in the way they are today. And she is going to give us a rundown, an exploration of this topic in the ways that only she can. We are also joined by Tyler Harris, the Executive Director of Project Liberal. Thank you, Tyler.
Hey, Max. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to a wonderful conversation with you and Virginia.
So I'd like to kick it off by asking you, Virginia, you wrote The Future and Its Enemies, of the very important and I'd say underrated book that everybody should be reading even today, all these years later, on what's the most important topic that we could be discussing, which is progress and abundance. And could you start by giving us an idea of what the central thesis was of this book that you wrote in the late 90s?
Sure. Just to contextualize it a little bit, this came out of work that I had done starting in 1990. I started to notice that there were certain weird things happening in the political environment where you saw people from what would be traditionally considered the left and people considered on the right getting together on certain issues, some for good and some for ill. And what arose from that was the thesis that our political and cultural landscape could be better understood rather than dividing it in these traditional left-right categories, dividing it between what I call dynamism and what I call stasis. And on the stasis side, you have people whose central goals or central motivating ideals are either stability or control, and we can talk about the difference between those two. And on the dynamism side, you have people whose central goals or values are around learning, and learning understood as a continuous and bottom-up process of trial and error, of experimentation and feedback, with no particular end goal. You look at how things are, think about how they might be better, and sort of innovate accordingly. And this was the general notion. Now, it's all very abstract the way I explain it, but you really see it in a lot of different issues. If your central value is control, you want to have everything very nailed down. You end up having a lot of regulation, a lot of the idea that something new is unregulated is considered a damning indictment. If your central ideal is stability, you just don't like the way the world has changed from some golden age usually, and those people, they disagree among themselves. This is a category that I in the book call reactionaries. Some of them want to go back to the Middle Ages. This is actually very popular right now, especially on the right. Some of them want to go back to being hunter-gatherers. You find some people on extreme environmentalists taking that position. A lot of people just want to go back to some 1950s. My friend Brink Lindsay from the Niskanen Institute has written, the 1950s, the right wants to live there and the left wants to work there. But essentially now the right wants to work there too, or something. Anyway, so in the book I have these categories of dynamism and stasis, and the notion of the book actually arose from noticing sort of coalitions in support of stasis. But then a lot of the book, and most of the book, is about, okay, well, what am I for? What is dynamism? How does it work? What's the point of it? How do we have a notion of progress that isn't marching toward a known end goal, which is this sort of technocratic, control-oriented notion of progress. What are the distinctions between that notion of progress and a more dynamist notion of progress? And there you go. There's the book.
Well, I think as Max alluded to, we both are of the opinion that it holds up incredibly well. But I'd love your perspective on looking back over the last 25, I guess 27 years since publication. Is there anything that you've sort of reevaluated, or maybe some nuance that has come out that makes you look back and think, gosh, I guess maybe I'm asking you to preview a fictitious second edition for us, but what your thoughts are there.
Right. Well, there are a couple of things. The first thing is, why wasn't it right immediately? It was right when I wrote it, but then 9/11 happened, basically, and we went through this long period of time where right and left stuck the way they had been, very much around foreign policy, and this didn't. The issues that I had thought were going to be the cutting edge issues of the day became less so. They now are. This is trade, immigration, evolution of technology. Biotechnology was one that was very on my mind at the time. I did not really foresee the sort of, well, I certainly didn't foresee a Trump administration with RFK Jr., the anti-vaxxer, as the designated HHS secretary. Maybe he won't get through, but that was something I didn't see coming. But it very much fits into this paradigm, which is that we have these things called vaccines, and there are people who are very uncomfortable with the idea of that kind of innovation, and partly because it's hard to understand. It requires specialization. And we have people who think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But thinking about, like, what would I change if I were doing it today? One thing I really did not see coming that is good is the rise of the sort of eco-modernist is a term that's used sometimes, but the rise of a very pro-innovation and sometimes dynamist, sometimes technocratic environmental approach. I was very, in the 90s, there was a sort of wonky, okay, we have water pollution, how shall we get rid of it, kind of environmentalist sort of problem solving. And there was this sort of reactionary, nature is always good, we shouldn't go against nature, things were better in some Edenic past, kind of green theory that was all about stability. And what you didn't have very much back then was what you see much more of today, particularly in the progress and abundance movement, which is people who are highly motivated by their environmental concerns, but looking to address those problems through more of a innovation-oriented approach. Now, some of those people are still very technocratic, and they just think that we should only do certain technologies and not others, and that should be required. But there is a lot more, and particularly I'm thinking around the Breakthrough Institute as one of the organizations, there's a lot more thinking of, we want, the goal should be abundant, clean, cheap energy. Those things, that is what we would like. How do we innovate to get there? That's the bottom-up process.
Do you have any idea how to quantify that? Because when I worry that, like, I see the same thing, and when I open my Substack, I see a lot of people who sound to me like eco-modernists, and they have a lot of great ideas. Reading one guy recently who talked about using diatoms as a way of carbon capture and all this really interesting stuff.
Right.
But then if you still think about like the Sierra Club or Greenpeace or these organizations, these giant legacy organizations, they don't seem to have changed. So is this like an available, for certain people who are just in particular spaces, it really feels like this is energized, but in the broader context, this is a drop in the bucket?
Well, okay, first thing you have to understand about the Sierra Club is it is huge, and it is a problem in this space, huge problem in this space. But how does the Sierra Club get so huge? It sends a bazillion direct mail pieces to, little old ladies like my mother, who send it $25 to save the butterflies, or that might have been some other environmental group. But she had a lot of mailers when I was going through her mail about saving butterflies. But I think there's a little bit of low involvement, I like nature represented there, that is broad but not deep. And what you have is it is at this point an opinion elite, people are paying a lot of attention. You have this growth of alternative approaches. Now, again, some of those are extremely technocratic, the Biden industrial policy approach, which had a million elements to it, and had Ezra Klein famously called it the everything bagel, kind of left liberalism of interest groups, very prescriptive, not very bottom-up oriented. But where I think you see it the most is on the shift in attitudes toward nuclear power. And this is very much a generational thing, I think, where people who are baby boomers and older tend to have these sort of antiquated notions of, and really weren't justified at the time, but of the extreme dangers of nuclear power. Whereas people who are younger tend to be more concerned about the dangers of climate change and nuclear power as this potential source, and potentially with new ways of doing it as well, source of clean energy, and I think taking on board the very real issue that we're not willing to go and be poor in order to reverse or control climate change. If we have a choice politically between being poor and not having a warming planet, and having a warming planet and living the way we're accustomed to and possibly getting richer, we will choose the second. I mean, that is the political message that voters send. And so if you're genuinely concerned about this problem of climate change, as opposed to just getting a lot of money through your direct mail campaigns, you have to look at technological solutions. And one of those solutions is, one of the available now solutions is nuclear power. There are other things like your diatoms that might be the available down the road solutions.
Do you see so do you see the future and its enemies when you wrote it? Were you thinking very much? Do you see this kind of in the tradition of Hayek and Schumpeter and other sort of thinkers on innovation and technology, sort of just like codifying it for the modern age in a way that's more palatable and more digestible?
Well, I think it is in that tradition. I mean, I've been somebody called me the OG of the progress and abundance movement, and there was some place where that was used, and somebody said, no, I think that was Bacon. So, and I can actually go back farther than that. I'm working on a little short piece about something called a book called Nova Ruperta, which came out in like 1580. It's all pictures, actually, of all the new great things of the modern world, and including the discovery of America, but other things, eyeglasses and grain, water mills for grain and things like that. So I think there there's something that starts a very long time ago where people start to think that the world could get better through the application of ingenuity, I guess would be the best, more general way to put it, because it's not necessarily through the application of science. In fact, a lot of things, the innovation precedes the understanding. And my most recent book, The Fabric of Civilization, which is about the history of textiles, you see that a lot, particularly in the history of dye, where people did amazing things and they had no clue what they were doing, and until like the 19th century, really. So it is in that general tradition of thinking about what are the origins of progress. How do market forces, to use a pretty lousy term, but how do decentralized competitive processes surface knowledge that is necessarily diverse and dispersed? There are a few things that are different about it. One is that what is my discipline? My discipline, I'm a generalist. I'm a journalist by training, insofar as I have any sort of professional training. It's not academic training. I'm trained in literature and economics academically, but I'm not an economist. I'm not a philosopher. And so when you read my work, it uses the tools that journalists use, which is storytelling, anecdotes, general statements backed up not just by numbers, although there are numbers, but by things you can picture, that sort of thing. So that is different from most of the people, even today, who write on this thing. I mean, if you read things from the Breakthrough Institute or from the millions of organizations that have the word abundance in there, you will get lots of statistics and not a lot of stories for the most part. So that's something that is different about the way I approach it. And of course, the issues are different. And the other thing is that I am very interested in what I have occasionally called the textures of everyday life. That is, the things that we take for granted, the things that aren't flashy like artificial intelligence, which will eventually be, there's the joke about artificial intelligence is the thing, that's the term we use to describe the frontier. That, there used to be, if you use Google Translate, that's artificial intelligence, but we don't call it that. We just call it Google Translate. There's lots and lots of things already embedded that are not large language models of the kind that we're talking about now. Anyway, the point is that things like the textiles that are all around us also embody a lot of innovation, a lot of ingenuity, a lot of intelligence, and we take them for granted. And if you read The Future and Its Enemies, there's lots of these little homey examples. I remember there's somebody, I can't remember who, maybe it's one of you, but I don't think so, is writing. He was kind of reading the book, and on the Substack, I can never remember what they call it, but their version of Twitter, he's like, oh my God, she's writing about tampons, which is sort of me, putting the younger me, being very aware that I'm a woman writing to a mostly male audience, but telling them, these things are actually important in people's lives. But that's something that's different about it. I mean, Hayek, you can read all of Hayek and there'll be
no tampons.
There'll not only no tampons, but there'll be like one example of dispersed knowledge in the use of knowledge in society. he won't tell you. He won't have like other examples of businesses doing this or that. There's very little of that because he wasn't that guy. He was a philosopher basically, and an abstract economist.
So how do you? So that was written, like you said, in 1998, and then a lot of other things happened. Like you said, we went into foreign policy, and then a couple of decades later, I guess it was Tyler Cowen who started talking about progress, understanding where progress comes from and innovation and all this, kind of in a new way or in a distinct way. And it seemed to get a lot of people excited for the notion that hadn't been excited in that way for quite some time, and sort of sparked a new movement.
Well,
is that about right?
That's a piece of it. I don't think that's the only thing. So Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison, one of the two brothers who founded Stripe, wrote this article in The Atlantic calling for progress studies as a sort of, not really they weren't really calling for an academic field, but they were saying we need people to try to think seriously about where progress comes from and what steps can be taken to make it more of it. And that helped to put a name. And I was at a conference where I think Patrick Collison said it's basically a hashtag, because what, at least my understanding of what he was getting at with that, was there were already people who were doing this kind of thing. And there was a guy named Anton Housen in the UK who was going back and looking very carefully about some of the things around the Industrial Revolution.
Matt Ridley wrote about it in How Innovation Works.
Matt Ridley's been writing about it forever. And there's a whole raft. All of these questions are a big part of economic history, academic economic history. And one of my frustrations was when people started doing it, people like Jason Crawford from Roots of Progress Institute, when he started tweeting about it, I was like, Jason, don't reinvent the wheel. He quickly caught up. I'm not meaning to diss him. He's doing great stuff. But it's like there are certain things like the origins of the Industrial Revolution. There are libraries full of books and academic articles and people going way deep into the weeds of very specific things. And you have to build from that. That's the other thing that's in my work in general, in The Future and Its Enemies, but is a through line through all my work, is, yes, I use the tools of a journalist. I use the storytelling techniques. But a big thing I do, and in fact the name of my LLC is intellectual arbitrage. That is, I look at what scholars do, because they do careful, detailed, in-depth research that is generally inaccessible to the general public. Not that you literally can't find it, but that you may have trouble translating or may not have enough time. And so partly what I do is try to bring that to people. So anyway, getting back to your question, where is this progress and abundance movement coming from? There were lots of things that happened at the same time, more or less the same time. You started to have people, first of all, Breakthrough Institute has been around for 20 years. So that's not a new thing, but they started to get more traction, partly because people started to realize we're not going to get these climate goals with the approach we're taking. It's not really working. They still have a lot. They're still a minority voice, but a growing one. There were people like Ezra Klein, who's a super technocrat and says so himself, but on the left, who started to worry about abundance, especially as the sort of democratic policies kept saying we're going to subsidize these things, and lo and behold, the supply is inelastic. There is no additional supply, and therefore all you get is increased prices. And this is, of course, something they've done in many fields, including education and famously including housing. And that's the other piece of this, is that the great success, insofar as there has been success so far, is in the YIMBY movement, which is the Yes in My Backyard movement, which is the pro-housing coalition, which very much is one of these left-right coming together for good and for ill on both sides, saying we have, with our regulatory, with our laws and our processes and the many, many veto points, we have created an enormous housing problem, shortage, in our most productive cities and increasingly everywhere, and not just in the US, but in Canada and in the UK. And we need to figure out ways to make it easier to build housing, both because it's good for people to have houses. It's important to people's lives. Talk about the texture of everyday life. But also from a general economic point of view, if you have places like LA, where I live, or San Francisco, or London, which are incredibly economically productive, and people who are not super rich can't afford to live there, you stifle your economic growth in general. You exacerbate inequality, because the kind of person who, the way it was explained to me once upon a time, is, there's a bartender in Ohio who could get a much higher paid job and be much more sort of productive, as an economist would measure it, in the Bay Area. But because of the price of housing, that person is not going to relocate. It's all well and good for the very high paid, software best programmer in the world, but we need to think about these other people too. And traditionally, in the US especially, people would just migrate. They would go to where the opportunity was, and they could, because they could find a place to live, because we built houses because we didn't think houses were bad, or apartments were bad. We thought they were good. And somewhere, and this was one of the roots of The Future and Its Enemies, somewhere around the 1970s and 1980s in California, people decided that growth was a bad word, that growth in the sense of newcomers were bad, and that the way to stop them was to make no place for them to live. And I watched this in real time happen when I moved to Los Angeles from Boston in 1986. And when I moved to Los Angeles, what you could get in an apartment for the same amount of money was just so much better than in Boston. That's no longer true. And housing felt incredibly abundant there compared to where I was coming from. And within, 5 or 6 years, that was over. And it's just gotten worse and worse and worse over time.
Just thinking just about the connections here, though, because I've done some work helping the YIMBY folks here in Austin, who thankfully have had some progress.
Yeah,
I mean, they've made some real gains here.
And they've made gains in California too. It's just hard slogging. I mean, that's why. I mean, they're the most successful people right now in terms of this sort of progress and abundance movement.
Is it? But I would say, after interacting with a lot of them, I'm sure every abundance person, everybody who would call themselves an abundance person, is also a YIMBY. But I don't know that every YIMBY is also an abundance person. Like a lot of the people that are in the movement or in these groups, you talk to them and they say, well, yeah, we need more housing is good, but what we really need is more bike paths, or things like that. And I'm like, oh, you were so close, but not quite there. So is it like the abundance thing is trying to sort of co-opt the YIMBYs?
No, okay, so my understanding, the YIMBY people I know best are in LA because that's where I live, and that's where I actually have like occasionally shown up at hearings and stuff as a citizen rather than as a, thinker, whatever. The YIMBY coalitions vary a little bit from place to place, but in general, what you have is you have people who want more housing, just more housing, and a lot of them are young and they want more housing because they want to live in it. There are varying degrees of how well they understand how housing markets actually work. You will have people who say, well, we need more housing, but it needs to be affordable. And so if somebody builds a development that is expensive, that's not going to help us. And that's a misunderstanding of how housing markets work. And, the people with a lot of money will always get housing. They will get it someplace. And if they don't get this in this fancy new apartment building, they'll get it in your, less expensive now neighborhood by bidding up the prices. But that is, and partly that's because a lot of these activists come from the left and they think landlords are bad and development is bad. But over time, I've seen that that's kind of erodes as people start to understand more about how housing actually works. That's one group. Those are housing specific concerns. Then there's what you're talking about, which is kind of they're urbanists. That is, they don't like cars, they like walkable neighborhoods, they like density, they have a very specific idea of the good life that they want to have everybody live. And in fact, in the Future and Its Enemies, I, take aim at people like that and support sort of sprawl. I mean, it's this, I don't think I use that term, but talk about Joel Garreau's book Edge City and sort of these more suburban areas that grow up and then start out as housing and then they develop businesses and become business centers and you don't have a central downtown. You have these urbanists, and one thing that, one message I have is, look, I am like that. I am like you in the sense that I like walkable neighborhoods. I like density. I don't really want to live in a place that is all little single family homes necessarily, or even big ones. But I know that is not how everybody thinks, and you need to respect that it's not how everybody thinks, and what we need is freer regulation that allows people to build all different kinds of housing. I find it hard to believe that the zoning ideal of large suburban tracts with no place to get, a bottle of milk used to be the classic thing, but, no neighborhood stores is really what people like. They like to have backyards and they like to have, places for kids to play, but maybe having a few things within walking distance they would like. But not everybody likes to live in a city. I understand that. And I think that's part of what you're talking about. When you talk about the bike, what they really like is bike paths. Those are people who want the urban environment to conform to their preferred lifestyle specifically. And that's very much the sort of technocratic mindset at work that, if I think this is good, everybody should have it by mandate. I think people get over that to some degree. The more they're actually involved in the negotiations and the process and hearing different voices, I think people start to understand that, it's nice to have a car I mean, I don't drive very much. I never have. And we spent our first 8 years in LA with one car. I've never been a big driver, although except for last summer when I drove to Nebraska. But that was a major trip, and I now had a hybrid. But it's there is this kind of urbanist ideal that is part of that movement. What's interesting, though, is that there are people who want it because they want their lifestyle. And then there's what people get taught in planning school. So people who are trained planners. And I don't know, my view of this is a little distorted by being heavily influenced by where I live in the UCLA and USC planning schools, which are less, everybody should live in the same thing. But they're less averse to markets is actually what I would put it. But what has happened is that nowadays in these big cities, the actual professional planners who work for the city government are more likely to be saying, yes, you should be able to build this, than no, you should not be able to build it. That the problem is not as much in the planning profession as it once was, as in the citizen activist type small groups often who are concerned. This is the NIMBY people, the no in my backyard people, because the planners, bless their little technocratic souls, are seeing we need, we don't have any place for people to live. It's bad for our city. We need to get more stuff built. And they may not exactly really be for sort of dynamic housing markets in the Virginia Postrel sense, but given where we are right now, they tend to be allied with the people who want to build stuff.
So it sounds to me like the progress studies stuff and the abundance agenda stuff. So the abundance stuff was sort of already around. The progress studies stuff was around, but it didn't call itself progress studies, and now it's sort of like a Schelling point, right? Somebody's saying, right, let's all coalesce around calling ourselves this.
As somebody who goes to these different conferences, and also reads stuff, what I would say is the abundance movement has its origins in the center left. And so there are people who are thinking, and not even, arguably Karl Marx was in the abundance movement. It depends or Samuel Gompers was the big American labor leader in the, late 19th, early 20th century. And he said, he was once asked, what do your people want? And he said more. That was his answer. It wasn't that they wanted like a socialist utopia. It was that just they wanted more stuff. They wanted more stuff for them. And that's a very strong tradition in the sort of left side of American politics. There's one thing actually that distinguished it from some of the European versions, which it was less about achieving some socialist utopia and more about getting people stuff. And so the abundance movement, I think, originates in that sort of center-left area. And progress, and maybe this is because of Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison, maybe it's because of Ayn Rand, I don't know, but it has a more right libertarian valence. If you go to the different conferences, if you go to abundance conferences, and again, now there are a million groups and I can't, but in the past, when I've gone to kind of abundance-oriented conferences, they have tilted toward the Democratic Party. In some cases, like with the Breakthrough Institute, quite explicitly. If you go to progress conferences, they're first of all less policy-oriented and more entrepreneurship-oriented. So they're less, it's less about what we should do in terms of the government and more about, can we do this? Would this technology work? Can you commercialize this? How do you get stuff that looks great in the lab out into the world? These kinds of difficult progress problems that aren't necessarily about policy. And they have a more sort of rate market-oriented valence there. So, but it's all, I think it's all one movement, and it's very similar. The sort of the fertility of it and vitality of it. Yes, it's still in some ways on the fringes of politics, but it's very much what I saw in the late 70s and early 80s when I was in college going on, where you had people on the left and the right traditionally doing things together in trying to figure out what the hell was wrong with the economy.
But have you seen, you said doing things together, have you seen them working together? I mean, have you seen the sort of abundance side and the progress side kind of working together on a policy specific goal or something?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned nuclear power.
Yeah.
I think that's one where you see both sides, or whatever. You see a coalition. There are coalitions around AI. Again, not all exactly the same, but the general idea that progress is good. That's a complicated thing, but in general, I would say that. And again, on housing, there's a lot of this. I mean, the research director of YIMBY, Nolan Gray, who's a friend of mine, is he's pretty much of a market-oriented guy. That's where his roots are, although he also is a professional planner, and so it's you definitely see it in the housing issues, in the YIMBY movement. I mean, part of it is that once you get into trying to do politics, then it becomes the art of the possible. So a lot of the progress that's been made on housing in California and elsewhere is, in a sense, very technocratic and has this urbanist element to it, because that's what you can get through the legislature. It's not that, I personally would say, let's repeal, CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act that allows a lot of veto points. Let's completely repeal it for housing. Let's not do what Governor Important Hair says we should do, Newsom, which is let's just repeal it for people who want to rebuild their houses after the LA fires. No, if it's not good for them, it's not good for anybody trying to build housing. Let's do that. That would be the Virginia approach. Could it get through the California legislature? I doubt it. What you can get through the California legislature is requirements that each city have a plan that has that projects its population growth and projects how many housing units will be built there, and the state has to approve that, and if the state doesn't approve that, your zoning goes away. I mean, that's an actual law. That's not the greatest thing, the greatest approach, but it's a hammer that's working. So, yeah.
So talking about politics being the art of the possible sort of opens the door to me to wonder how we win more people, not just to progress and abundance, but let's say, how do you win people to dynamism? I mean, is that an innately felt characteristic? Is that appeal to someone because of who and how they are? Or can you convert someone, and how do we do it?
Well, I don't know. I think I literally don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Because I have seen people who said, oh man, I read your book and it changed the way I think about this, but maybe that was just their personality. I mean, I try to persuade people by making connections and telling stories and illustrating how it can be possible that we work through a bottom-up discovery process rather than knowing things in advance, how things will come out. I think people generally understand that in their everyday lives, whatever their everyday lives may be. I mean, dynamic processes of the kind I talk about are everywhere. They're in recipes, they're in child rearing, they're in running small businesses, et cetera, et cetera. They're not just about high tech or some frontier, the frontier of human achievement in some sense. There are things we do every day. We look at what we don't like and we try to fix it. And we criticize other people's decisions and try to do better. But I don't know. My political understanding is that dynamists are always in the minority. And that in modern liberal democracies, technocrats dominate, but they're not necessarily a majority. And that what you have to do in order to make progress, both progress in getting where the sort of laws you want and progress in the broader sense, is you have to make alliances. And generally speaking, I would say that what dynamists have to do is peel off some of the technocrats. And at the time I was writing the book, when the internet was new and regulating the internet was a big issue, that's what happened, and that's why the internet developed in a pretty free way. And it's certainly why we got what I talk in the book about, the Cox-Wyden Act, which was an amendment to the 1996, I forget what it's called, but it was like No Porn on the Internet Act. They were worried about Communications Decency Act and it's the one thing that survived, which is Section 230, which says if you provide a platform that allows people to put things on the internet, you will not be considered a publisher for legal liability reasons, simply because you have terms of service that exclude certain types of speech. And this is what gave rise to social media, but nobody, including the authors and including the opponents in 1996, was thinking about anything like social media. And this is one of the things I think is important to understand. It's like, whatever problem you may have with social media, if that's today's problem, that's not a problem people were thinking about in 1996. What they were thinking about in 1996 was, how do you make it so that every internet website isn't full of pornography? Now, they also would have wanted to ban a lot of stuff that is available on the internet today, and that was struck down in the courts. But the reason 230 is important is so that you can create a Facebook that is not all pornography. With all due respect to the OnlyFans folks, not everybody wants to see pornography everywhere. And so, but you can't have these platforms that allow lots and lots of people to contribute, like YouTube, for example. If the platform owner is liable for every single thing that goes on there. Anyway, I've completely lost the thread.
Is that what, to Tyler's point, is that what we mean then when we're talking about kind of success for progress studies? Is it clearly for the abundance agenda folks, it sounds like success is getting certain democratic politicians or constituents to think of things in a somewhat different way, and then end up having impact, say, on YIMBY policies or on nuclear power issues or hopefully other things in the future. But for the progress studies folks, is it is it thinking about is it trying to have an influence on the Republican Party, or is it trying to have an influence on the constituency? Is it trying to change minds and get more people to see the world in a dynamist way? Or is it having an impact just on the elites, and hopefully that sort of filters down?
Yeah, I can't speak for progress studies in general. I think people have different models of the world and different interests personally. I think that what you see a lot of in progress studies that distinguishes it a little bit from the abundance stuff is people thinking about institutions other than government. I mean, there are people who think about government, but there are people who think about institutions other than government. So, for example, there's this guy I really like, both personally and I like his work, called Ben Reinhardt. And he is very concerned with the problem of academic labs produce all kinds of great ideas, particularly in the area of materials, that there is no clear path for those things to be commercialized, because there's this valley of death where you get beyond the things that help you publish in an academic lab and beyond the things that get you grants, but not yet to the point where you can really make a lot of money. There's stuff that has to happen. And there were times in the past where you had very, very large companies that had literal protected monopolies or de facto monopolies, and that had, research labs. So Bell Labs being a very famous one, but there was a thing. I write in the Fabric of Civilization about DuPont and their research lab, and they would develop things and they would figure out whether or not there was a use for them, as opposed to starting with the use case and going from there. Those have disappeared for various and sundry reasons. Even companies that have sort of research arms tend to be very specifically focused. So what Ben and others are thinking about is, can we create institutions that will bridge that gap, that will eliminate that valley of death? And that's not a think tank policy problem. That's really an institution building problem. And so what progress studies is saying, as a movement, I guess, is that if you're a person, particularly a very rich person who has an interest in progress, you should look around and think about funding some of these things to see if we can make the world better off in general. So I think that's one thing that's happening that's not just the kind of thing that tends to get focused on because it's easy to focus on politics. That said, I think there are definitely people in progress, who would have called themselves progress studies people or more progress people who are concerned about political things, are concerned about what's going on. And the weird thing that's happening now is you have this very strange coalition in the Trump administration that I would not have predicted, which is a coalition between reactionaries, like really strong reactionaries, the life should be, and you even have in that coalition the Catholic integralists who want to go back to the Middle Ages and have a theocracy. I mean, literally in that coalition, you had the most reactionary kind of people. Well, okay, not the hunter-gatherer people. Those are on the left. But anyway, and these kind of more or less dynamist people like Mark Andreessen and arguably Elon Musk, who just want to be able to do stuff. And that strikes me as a fairly unstable coalition because, going back to Tyler's question, the personalities are so different that and the values are so different. I think that it's at this point I'm just an observer. This is really interesting. I'm old. nothing I say is going to make a difference in what happens. Well, I hope for the best.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of us here can do.
Yeah, well, and that may be colored a little bit. I'll say for those listening, because I'm not sure exactly when this is going to go up and out or when your ears might find it. But we're sitting here having this conversation the day after Donald Trump's second inauguration, fresh on minds for sure. It may make this a little bit of a loaded question, but trying to look past some of that, proximate fog. Are you generally optimistic about progress and abundance and dynamism in the future, or do you think that we're at a really dangerous moment where these ideas might be at risk of falling by the wayside?
Yeah, I think it is a dangerous moment. It's a danger. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic, but it is a dangerous moment. There are a lot of impulses, I guess is the best word, swirling out there in the world, not just in the United States, but internationally, that either explicitly or implicitly could put an end to the kind of progress we have experienced over the past few decades. And some of them are very distant from us in terms of any influence we could have. For example, I wouldn't call it dynamism, but certainly there was this period of like 20 years when China was a very dynamic place, when when I was working on The Fabric of Civilization, this isn't in the book, but I went to this factory, this textile factory in Hangzhou, and heard the story of the entrepreneur who had started it. And it was a thriving business. It wasn't one of the giant factories, but it was definitely. And he was, he and his wife were working in a textile factory as machine operators, and he was seeing all these other people like start companies and get rich by his standards. We're not talking billionaires, but and he was like, I want to do that. So he got one machine and set it up in his apartment, and got a client, a Japanese company that was just starting to sell in China, and they were doing this embroidery and basically bootstrapped. After they got to a certain point, then he put a machine in the neighbor's apartment. It started, and this company was bootstrapped, and now it's this very high-tech company with state-of-the-art machinery making various textile products. I think it would be much harder to do that in China today because Xi's regime is sort of afraid of entrepreneurs in a way. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's not what it was. And of course, the other thing, going back to why, there's always the danger of a giant war, which also could put a stop to a lot of the progress we're seeing too. So you've kind of got reactionary elements in the U.S., in other places, illiberal, anti-liberal elements. And dynamism is a form of liberalism. It's a form of liberalism that foregrounds learning as opposed to foregrounding justice or freedom. All those things are good. Liberalism is generally for all those things, but different forms of liberalism emphasize or foreground certain specific things. But it is definitely a dangerous time. It's also a very hopeful time. We could have a tremendous takeoff, and we're certainly seeing a lot of technological progress. We've talked a little about AI. There's all the space stuff, which is a big deal. And again, Barack Obama in the Obama administration, they changed the law to allow a lot more commercial space flight. And there were people in NASA and people in the space community who were like, this is the end of American dominance in space. This is evil, horrible. And then there were other people who had been longing for this for, since the 70s. I think you could probably find issues of Reason magazine long before I was even reading it, much less working there, talking about, privatized space flight. And this is what allowed, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all these people, but particularly that allowed SpaceX to prosper, not just to be sort of a dream. So that was a kind of dynamism policy in an administration that generally people would not consider dynamist, but they just let go this one little thing, and it made a big difference. So, I'm an incrementalist. The process that I describe of how progress happens from the bottom up is an incremental process. And I think in politics, that's how the world works as well. There is no scratch. There is no starting from scratch. When you try to start from scratch, it's a disaster.
I'm really interested though in this question of how do you create, and I know we touched upon this and you said, well, maybe there's no good answers, but maybe we can brainstorm some answers. How do we inspire the next generation to be more dynamist?
Right.
And because I'm sure you can get them excited about, going to Mars. Elon wants to go to Mars. Let's go to Mars. Okay, but does that mean that that somehow inspires dynamism later? Because in my own life, I feel like I've been dynamist. Like you said, when I read this book, I was kind of predisposed to already find a lot of these ideas interesting, even back then. And I think in my case, I watched Star Trek in the 90s, and I went to Epcot Center when it was still the sort of thing that it was back then, which really inspired sort of the techno-optimism and futurism and all this stuff. And then I read Hayek, and I took economics, and so I sort of mixed it all together, and that's what you get.
Right.
But that's kind of like my little idiosyncratic way to do it. How do you get so many other people to have this?
So this gets back to this is a great opportunity for me to plug a recent big think piece that I wrote. So I write for Works in Progress, which is owned by Stripe. It didn't start out being owned by Stripe. It started out being, four friends in London who thought this thing should exist. And that was before Patrick Collison wrote this article with Tyler Cowen, but then Stripe acquired it. So I wrote an article in Works in Progress about glamour and progress, about the glamour of progress, and how progress was glamorous in the early 20th century, really up the first 2/3 of the 20th century, let's say, how it lost its glamour and what that entails, and what that tells us about today to some degree. I mean, I could probably write a book on this, and so this combines two of my books, because I also wrote this book called The Power of Glamour. And glamour is this imaginative process where something glamorous makes you have a feeling of projection and longing. And those things vary widely with the personality and with what they want and with what they respond to. So for you, Star Trek could be glamorous. For somebody else, winning an Oscar is glamorous. There are different things that people want and different things that they find glamorous. And glamour always has certain elements. It has this element of the promise of escape and transformation, different, better life in different, better circumstances. It has mystery, and it has grace, where it conceals the flaws, the difficulties, the dangers, and in some cases, really bad things. So, progress was glamorous in the early 20th century. This is start with 1939 World's Fair, and have a friend who conveniently enough, I have a friend who's born in 1928 who I interviewed and lived near the World's Fair in Queens. So I interviewed her about her experience as a little girl. I interviewed her for The Power of Glamour. Then I interviewed her again for this article. But the part of what I came to in understanding this article that isn't in either of the book is the idea that progress was glamorous in the 20th century to three different groups, and this is the personality types. One were the people who, at this point today, probably form the core of the progress studies group, which are people who kind of saw it as adventure, as excellence, as achievement, kind of like being an explorer. These are the people who want to go to Mars, because it's cool and it's human flourishing and become an interplanetary species. That's a small group. Then there's another small group that is small, is bigger, and very, very influential in the early 20th centuries. And these are basically technocrats. These are people who define progress as eliminating waste, as creating. There is a notion of abundance, but it's also tied up with redistribution. There's a lot of concrete in their visions of progress, a lot of roads and bridges, and this is, Bill Clinton used to have this metaphor, a bridge to the future, which sounded really great, but it's also, one path for everybody. And it's hard for us today to understand just how incredibly glamorous that vision of progress was to people who had been living on farms or in crowded cities that, could sweep away all the dirt and debris and, and this was also tied up with the notions of central planning, which was this idea that, we've had all these great industrial companies, railroads, and steel mills, and they work at a scale that's unseen in human history, and they work by, planning their activities, and we could do the same thing with the entire society. So that was another group. Together, those groups do not form a majority. What really mattered is that there was this huge group of regular people who are not elites, who are getting refrigerators, and they're getting indoor plumbing, and they're getting vacuum cleaners, and they're going to the movies, and they're getting cars, and they're experiencing progress in their everyday life. Either they're actually experiencing it, or they can foresee experiencing it. And I have this great quote, which is also in The Power of Glamour. There was this survey done in, I think in the 80s, maybe, I can't remember, of British women who were interviewed at length about their experiences going to the movies in the 1930s. See, academics, they're great. They do things like this. All these people. And one of the things that came through was there was this kind of almost like science fictional aspect to movies that were not at all science fiction. They were romances, or they were, women's pictures. And because they showed people using refrigerators and vacuuming and these things that don't seem at all glamorous to us, and that certainly don't seem like science fiction. But the women in Britain who were watching these things, they didn't have refrigerators, and they didn't have vacuum cleaners, and they could envision a better life because technology was changing the nature of certain kinds of luxuries. There was this experience that we are now very accustomed to it, especially we've seen it happen with computers and cell phones, all these kinds of things, where something would be new and rich people would have it. But over time, it would get cheaper and cheaper, and everybody would have it. And this was very different from the traditional luxuries of, giant country houses with lots of servants, or, being able to go to the theater versus being able to go to the movies versus being able to watch TV versus YouTube. This is sort of a strange, there's been this democratization of luxury, and that was a big part of why progress seemed so great for the first, 2/3 of the 20th century. Then comes the baby boom, and they're all used to it, been there, done that, and they're not impressed. And that's when we start to get this kind of backlash in the late 60s and 70s. And so I think the question now, and this is why I think housing is so critical, it is critical to win on housing, because housing affects everything. My editor at Works in Progress, Sam Bowman, and some others have this article, The Housing Theory of Everything. And it affects people's everyday lives. And when one of the reasons that you hear a lot of pessimism from young people sometimes is the idea that they're spending all their income on housing. And they often will complain about their income. They feel like their income is stagnant. But even if their income isn't, because of the housing. So I think that's absolutely critical to win on those issues, to make housing abundant. If housing is abundant, people will feel progress in their everyday lives, and that makes a huge difference. There are other things that make people feel progress in their everyday lives. One thing that really got muffed, especially in California, was the coming of the COVID vaccine. I mean, I don't talk about this in my article, but vaccines and miracle drugs were another big element of progress in the 20th century. I mean, I'm old enough to have really, really gotten a very bad case of mumps when I was in the first grade. And, the idea that you could have a mumps vaccine, I'm for that. Also, my mother was pregnant in 1964 when rubella was going around. Fortunately, my brother and I did not get it because we had colds and were kept away from our friends. But rubella causes birth defects in pregnant women. We have a rubella vaccine. It came out when I was a teenager. That's amazing. And of course, people always talk about polio, which was before my time. I'm not that old. But what happened with the COVID vaccine should have been this incredible miracle where suddenly we can all get back to our lives. But it wasn't sold that way, especially in blue states, in places like California. It was like, no, you still have to wear a mask when you're outdoors and stay in your house. And that's unfortunate because it fed an anti-vaccine kind of backlash, which would have happened anyway, because that has its roots in this late 60s, early 70s anti-progress, whatever backlash. But I think that I think that it's very important to do the sort of intellectual work and to do the community building among elites, that evil word, but among people who think for a living, whether they are writers and scholars or whether they are entrepreneurs doing high-tech stuff. And I think that Roots of Progress in particular has done great work on community building, and I think that's really, really important. And that work includes programs for younger people who want to identify as being part of the progress movement and want to write Substacks or whatever. But I think that we have to keep our eyes on the prize of better lives for regular people who do not deal with ideas for a living. And if you can deliver that, and this is very much what Trump's victory represented, and especially the growth of his popularity among traditionally Democratic groups, was saying, I'm going to make your lives better. And that's what elections get decided on. Now, again, I think he has this completely unstable coalition. I think the reactionary elements of it, his trade and immigration agendas, not only profoundly anti-dynamist, but going to make the country poorer, which is not going to be good for him either. So it remains to be seen what will happen. But I think those of us who think and write and do podcasts and this sort of thing, deal with ideas for a living, have to remember that we are not normal, and that the victory, when progress has been possible and popular, it has delivered for normal people, not just for people who want to go to Mars.
I'm worried that the normal people, though, as you're talking about it, as you mentioned with the COVID stuff, they're very fickle, right? They could change on a dime to see something that was quite a wonderful innovation as something that's now quite negative. And Trump saw this himself, right? When he started, it was one of his rallies where he started, I did this COVID vaccine and I warp speed, and everybody started booing him. Whoa, okay. Well, that's not what I'm going to talk about then.
Right. No, it's, but I think if from the beginning he had sold it and pushed the idea that this means life goes back to normal, and anybody who says, the vaccine means anything other than life goes back to normal is bad. I mean, it's not necessarily how I would do it, but although I do think that, but I think that if it had been sold in a very Trumpian way, his followers would have followed him. But the problem is that by the time he kind of woke up and realized that his followers cared about how the vaccine was being implemented, it was too late.
There is one way in which if it plays out this way, I'd be very, very worried. Which is, this concept of affective polarization, where just because as soon as one political side starts to think this is our issue and we're going to see it this way, the other side immediately wants to sort of go to the opposite extreme. And I think the left did this with a lot of environmental issues, very almost as if it were deliberate. But they, Al Gore in with his movie, whatever it was, around 2000 or something.
Yeah. Inconvenient
where he kind
truth, yeah, right.
Yeah, where he just polarized the electorate. Now this forever will be a hardcore Democratic issue, and everybody else. So the right took it as we're going to be the opposite of whatever that is. So I would worry that, especially the abundance folks who are so tied to the Democratic Party, would end up, if they kind of take on these issues a little too deeply, then we're going to see the right, certainly, especially if it's kind of a Trumpy MAGA right, kind of purposefully and instinctually reject all of this stuff. They're going to shove to Mark Andreessen, Musk, to the extent to which they are dynamists, will be shoved away because they're going to be seen as members of the left.
Right.
And
we saw a little bit of that with the little debate about H-1B visas, which, first of all, people have no idea. The typical person has absolutely no idea how the immigration system works, for good reason, because it's incredibly, ridiculously complicated, and there's a million categories. And, you have to have a lawyer to explain all these categories, and so because people say, like, well, why don't they come legally? It's like, you think you can just come legally from Mexico?
Yeah, good luck.
Good luck with that. Unless you have like a PhD or something. But there are definitely elements that could happen. But what I hope happens is, what we have now and what we had in the 90s is that people, that dynamism has a place at the table in both parties. And there'll be different cultural aspects. I mean, I was at this abundance, it was a breakthrough. It was an abundance conference in Washington. It was, I got there through Breakthrough, but there were several other groups that sponsored it to have abundance in their names. I'm sorry, abundance people, you need to work on this branding, because I can't keep these groups straight, and they all sound the same to me. But anyway, and there was a panel about politics, about building abundance factions, and the idea of an abundance faction is that parties are coalitions of people who don't necessarily agree with everything. And so within the Democratic Party, you have this kind of, more socialist-y kind of people, Bernie Sanders-y faction. You have a more of a center left faction. You got these different factions, and you could have an abundance faction within the Democratic Party, and the similar in the Republican Party. You've got, it's in flux, but you could have an abundance faction within the Republican Party, and on issues, those you could have bipartisan working together from those different factions. And this is how politics has often worked. It's not how it's been working in recent years, but it's historically. The problem was there was nobody on the panel who was a Republican. The moderator was, but he was being very moderating and not participating. So I said, in the Q&A, hey, there was no Republican. I would have really liked to hear from a Republican on this issue, because I'm very concerned about whether there can be an abundance faction of the Republican Party. And afterwards, several Republicans came up to me, one who worked on the Hill, and one guy said, who's more of a MAGA Republican, said, make America great again. What is that? That's abundance. And, he has a point. You can spin it that way. And I think that in Trump's less than linear brain, abundance is part of making America great. I mean, when he thinks about, now his mind is stuck in a certain period, so he worries too much about steel mills and not enough about, chip factories or whatever. But and that's not, whereas Biden worried about it for the same for different reasons, political reasons, and pro-union. But he is somebody who likes to build buildings, and there is a potential for there to be an abundance faction within the MAGA faction within the Republican Party. It's possible. However, the caveat is, okay, let's go back to the great success of YIMBY. Back in the first Trump administration, HUD got on the YIMBY bandwagon for about 5 minutes. They put out this thing, it was like, need to be able to build. It was very like, free market economisty kind of thing. Very traditional, market-oriented Republican. We like builders and developers kind of thing. But then immediately there was this element where it's like, oh, it's an attack on the suburbs. Because, going back to the people who want the bike paths, there is that element within the YIMBY coalition. And so what I say to them, because I am not, I'm a thinker and writer, I say, listen, YIMBYs, you need to be for more housing of all forms. YIMBYs have been very good at understanding the missing middle, which is the sort of low-rise but multifamily, very popular forms historically in places like LA, almost impossible to build now. Very popular, the ones that still exist. How can we get more of them? But what they haven't started to think about is, what do you do about the very real fact that many people would like a house with a yard? How do you make that easier? And how do you make the market signals more accurate so that they aren't just telling you, we want far out suburbs with houses with yards, because that turns out to be the thing that's easy to build, but because it's what people really want. And in my second book, The Substance of Style, I actually did a bunch of interviews with essentially private planners, people who plan large housing developments. And what was interesting was in that period, so this was in the early, that book came out in 2003, is what people were paying extra for were some of these urbanist qualities, like having a town center you could walk to. They still wanted a house with a yard, but they wanted some of these things that had been zoned out of places like where I grew up or where my husband grew up, in the sort of places that were built in the immediate post-war period, because that was that was a period where the technocrats said, oh, separate uses. Separating uses is not what people do when left to their own devices. So I agree. That we need to work very hard. Progress and abundance people, people who believe in liberalism, we need to work very hard to be present in in both party coalitions, not necessarily in every faction, because there will be factions who are out and out dedicated to our destruction. But if you look at the FDR coalition, that didn't make any sense at all. The Democratic coalition up until really through Jimmy Carter, it didn't make any sense, but it was viable. So these things
There's a lot of political practicality in that, and you're hitting on something very close to my heart, which is sort of making YIMBYism safe for the suburbs. As I sit here in suburban Virginia having this conversation. But it's not just because I think there's, politically the suburbs are kind of the epicenter of a lot of political power anyway. You need to win suburban voters to do anything in terms of building large-scale reform for any of this. There's also a really tangible case. Artificial scarcity inflates single-family home values, but it does it artificially. It does it everywhere.
Right.
So I could sell my house for an inflated price, and that's good for me. But then where do I go? Presumably to another house that I now have to buy for an inflated price. So I have that wealth on paper, but really, other than being able to borrow against it, there's not much you can do in the suburbs. Whereas if you allow development, then you actually tangibly increase the value in that community. You either are benefiting from, like you said, you're benefiting from a more walkable community, you're benefiting from some amenities, you still have the backyard with your kids, but now there are more restaurants you can walk to, there are, particularly for younger people important, more restaurants you can DoorDash from because of the proximity in the suburbs. But, your quality of life goes up. But also, if that's not for you, you then have real tangible wealth that you can cash out and extract and go a little further out and find that place that meets your needs in a way that you really genuinely benefit from that development that happens around you. And I think that, it speaks to, sort of, yes, there is an element of political persuasion that's very direct. Activists go out and they engage with communities and they try to bring these messages to persuade people. There's the broader cultural factors that you're talking about that are going to reach, I think, many, many more people than the direct political action. This idea of progress being glamorous, progress being something that people feel like is positively impacting their lives for the better. And then I wonder if the third leg of that stool isn't getting people to engage personally in these sort of small acts of dynamism themselves, to adopt that more dynamist mindset. And, we've mentioned a couple of times the fabric of civilization. I know it's your backdrop behind you also for those who can see us as well as hear us. There's a wonderful video series that you can find on Virginia Postrel's YouTube revolving around the fabric of civilization. Tons of great videos about the history of fabrics and how those tie into the modern era and conversations like we're having now. But also some home dyeing projects that were very fascinating. I really enjoyed watching that. It made me want to go dye fabrics in my kitchen, and that being that strikes me as a very dynamic activity. You're taking a lot of initiative, you're doing a lot of problem solving, you're innovating as things work and don't work and finding your way through it. How much value do you think there is, especially as our culture really decentralizes online, in encouraging that sort of just individual, non-political embrace of dynamic pursuits?
Well, first of all, I think that there is a tremendous hunger for what I call in the Works in Progress essay, efficacy. That is, as partly because of all the software things that we have that just do stuff for us, people have this hunger to feel like that to feel capable and to feel in control. And one of the things that is so great about YouTube is you can find a video that will teach you how to do basically anything. I mean, if you look at my YouTube, sort of the algorithms, what am I getting from YouTube? It's all like weaving and sewing videos and learning Italian. I mean, it's like, but whatever you need, you can find. And that is one of the things that's very understated. We went through this period, I don't know, 10 years or so ago, maybe a little bit longer, where everybody was all about like online education, getting rid of colleges and all that stuff. And it never really took as a substitute for higher education. But YouTube is just this fabulous educational resource, whether you want to learn practical things like how to dye with avocado pits, or you want to, I don't know that that's practical, but I have a big bag of avocado pits. Or whether you want to learn a foreign language or how to fix your sink. I have to go back to think about my high school nerd self, all the things that I could have learned from what the resources that are available now for free. It's just amazing. I would have been so happy because the foreign languages was the thing I really wanted to learn, and it was very hard because I went to a poor high school. It was mediocre at best, and one of the things it did not offer were many foreign languages beyond 2 years. So you never could actually really learn a foreign language, you just get started. But I think that what's important, people experience those kinds of dynamic processes all the time, and I think they could do them more. What they don't do is they don't connect them to other things. They don't realize that all over the place people are doing this, and they're doing it in running dry cleaners. There's actually a great example in The Future and Its Enemies of something about the New York City Council trying to tell dry cleaners how they should charge for prices or something. I can't remember exactly the thing, but John Tierney wrote a very funny column about it back in the day. What they don't connect the two things. And one of the things I point out is that we have one element of American life that is totally dynamist. That is, anybody can enter, anybody can criticize, anybody can create a competing organization, and that is religion because of the First Amendment. This is one of the reasons that America is the most religious rich country. That's not the only reason, and there's, and obviously one of the things you can enter with is people critiquing religion, but we live in that, and we take it for granted. We think it's totally normal that that's the way religion runs in this country, and it's not normal. It's neither normal historically. It's not even normal today. I mean, most European countries have an official church. So that is one reason I say this sort of trial and error process is something that applies to recipes and child rearing and sports and all these kinds of things that are part of everyday life that are not grand go to Mars kind of visions. I mean, if you look at the level of play in any sport today, it's much higher than it once was, and that's because of the competitive pressures to get better and the knowledge that's available. And this also goes back to YouTube. People can find out things from YouTube today and learn how to, particular basketball moves. Say that when my brother, who's actually used this as an example, was in high school playing basketball. The only way you would even get a tip was if some friend went to some basketball camp and came back with it. And so I think one of the things we need to do is remind people that the world wasn't always the way it is today, and that even when The Future and Its Enemies was written, there were lots of things we take for granted that are great that we didn't have even that recently.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this tour of a handful of connected and important subjects. I'm still hoping that we find ways to not only make the average person somewhat more dynamist, but to create some of those adventurers too, like the important, deep constituency, because you get more of those, you get a lot of stuff.
Yes, that's definitely the case. And also, if you get more of those who know each other and see each other as a movement, I think that is what I think particularly the progress studies, even the idea of progress studies as a hashtag, what Roots of Progress is doing with its gatherings and with its various programs, what all of this proliferation of abundance groups in Washington, not all of which are Democratic oriented, creating that sense of community, of intellectual community, and just like people to be your friends is important too. And I think, and that's actually podcasts we haven't talked about despite being on one. One of the funny things about podcasts is that it creates this sense of intimacy, even with people you don't know. And radio always had that sense, that had that too. There's something about that audio kind of medium that makes people feel connected, and I think that's valuable in and of itself.
I've been listening to Russ Roberts, I think, since like 2006, and I feel like I know the guy so well.
Right,
but
exactly.
This kind of stuff. Well, again, thank you, Virginia. Thank you for coming on. You've been very generous with your time, and hopefully folks are a little more familiar with the space and a little excited to learn more. And where can they find more of your work?
Well, I have a Substack with the creative name Virginia's Newsletter at vpostrel.substack.com. And basically I use vpostrel as my handle on pretty much everything. I think YouTube it's different because they assigned one, but and my website is vpostrel.com.
Cool. And we'll link to all that stuff in the descriptions below, no matter what format you're seeing this in. Virginia, Tyler, thank you both for joining me, and until next time.